Okay, here is how you set up one of the Metabo angle grinders for sanding or grinding or wire brushing in the Tyler shop. We've got a little lever here, which is going to allow you to place this shield on your grinder. It might take a little bit of persuasion. All the shields go on in the top dead position so that you've got your three notches sort of lining up. It might take a little bit of persuasion, but once it's on there, it should allow you to spin around. And you'll notice that that little lever allows this shroud to lock in different positions. So you can rotate it around and it'll click into place for different positions when you're grinding. Then you're going to need to put a handle on there so that you could use two hands. And there's two positions for attaching a handle. I'm a righty, so I like to have my handle on the left. And if you need to, you've got another hole to place the handle on the other side. So I'm also taking note at the direction of spin. There's always going to be a little arrow on your angle grinder. This one tells me that it's going to spin in this clockwise direction. And so with the shroud, the shield sort of in that left-hand position, the handle on the left, I can grind and have my sparks shoot down and away from myself and anyone around me. Now we're going to ask ourselves, what sort of media are we going to be putting on here? One of the simplest things to put on to your angle grinder is going to be like a knot wire brush or one of these non-woven abrasive Velcro backup pads, or even less common, one of these grinding wheels with an arbor nut already built into it. These guys all have the nuts attached to the media directly. So these are pretty easy. You just sort of thread them on there, and in order to thread it on there without the arbor spinning, you hold down this little button on the back side. So as it spins, hold the button down and it'll lock in place where you need it. So with one of these knot wire brushes, you got to realize that this shroud, especially different shapes, these cut brushes, they're going to eject a lot of material out past this shroud. It's still a good idea to have one of those on there just for sort of safety reasons, but just realize that it's going to throw a lot of debris everywhere. So wear a face shield and protect the people around you by shielding them with a welding screen or something. So there's your basic, your most simple one. You probably want a gloved hand to remove these wheels. They get really sharp. So let's look at one of the more tricky operations for folks learning, which is how to hold one of these cutting wheels or sanding discs, or in this case the most common, grinding wheel. So here we've got a 1/4 inch thick grinding wheel. Note that it's thicker than, say, a little 1/8 inch or 1/16 inch cutting wheel. That means that we're going to hold it with first a shim and a nut. And so that's your most basic operation for these non-threaded applications. The sanding disc is going to be a little different. So the first thing you want to do is put on a shim. On these Metabos, they have a recessed area and a little raised area. The recessed area has a little bit of a notch in there, and that corresponds with the notched back end of that arbor. So we rotate that until it clicks in. The little raised area is what's going to center our wheel. It's super critical that you always center your wheel. If for some reason you put that shim on in the wrong direction, that wheel is just going to rattle around down there and you're not going to be able to hold that safely. So always have that little raised portion face up. Now we grab a nut, and the nut is going to be what's going to hold that wheel in place. Notice that the difference between a shim and a nut is that the nut has threads on it. So shims don't have threads, nuts do have threads. So the nut is going to go on this thicker wheel with the raised portion down. It also has a recessed portion here for thinner wheels. So with a thicker wheel, we can put raised side to raised side, and it will hold it safely, and that's what we're hoping to achieve. Notice that there's nothing rubbing on the back end. We don't have it sticking out past the shroud, and the nut is relatively flush with the top surface there. If it wasn't, you could always add a shim. So let's take a look at maybe adding a slight shim to the back end of that arbor nut, and then we'll try and hold one of these cutting wheels. This is a raised hub cutting wheel, allows you to get into tighter spaces, and so I've got myself centered on that shim, on that little raised portion. And in this scenario, if I were to try and put this on wrong with that raised center down again, notice this just spins around. So that's not going to transfer the motion of the angle grinder. We need to place that dimpled side down. It even says it on there. There's some writing, you can't see it in the video, but it says for 1/8 inch wheels, place this side down. And so now here's your ideal situation. You've got the shroud still protecting you, nothing's rubbing here, it's not sticking out past, and that arbor is totally flush with the top of the nut. And the arbor is also getting plenty of purchase though on that nut. It's not like the nut is, you know, sunken way, or the arbor is sunken way in past the nut. So this is how you hold a thinner wheel, like a cutting wheel, or let's try out one of these flap wheels, another really handy thing to use in the metal shop, but we'll just have that raised center. Notice how the hub on the flap wheel is also really thin, and so we use that same setup as the cutting wheel to make sure that we're grabbing it with the recessed portion. And that would go the same thing with, say, like one of these unitized discs. Looks super thick, but it's actually thin back in there, just an 1/8 inch thick. And if you're using like one of these masonry wheels for some kind of concrete operation, they're also pretty thin, and you'd hold that like so as well. So that's how you hold a thin piece of material, or a thin grinding wheel, versus a thick one. So that's critical. Next, let's take a look at something a little bit trickier, which is one of these sanding discs. Notice how the sanding discs, they're pretty thin, they're pretty floppy. That means that you need to back them up. And so we have these backer pads. This backer pad happens to have a threaded portion in there. Sometimes they're unthreaded and they just drop on there. It works both ways. And the other thing I'm noticing is that when I thread this guy on here, the first thing I check, even before I put a sanding disc on there, is what's the position of my arbor to the surface of this backer pad. If it's slightly above, you're good. If it's slightly below, you're usually good too. But if it's way up or way down, then you're going to want to adjust something. So if it's way sunken, you know, sticking out, then you're going to want to put a shim behind that backer pad. Then we'll place on our sanding disc, and then notice that I'm going to use a different style of nut. There's two different styles of arbor nuts. You've got your one for your grinding wheels, another raised hub and things like that, and then you've got your sanding disc arbor nut. The sanding disc arbor nut allows you to hold your sanding discs as flush as possible to the surface of the sanding disc. This gives you the most area to work with. If you have one of these other nuts sticking out of the top of your sanding disc, you're not going to be able to get low enough. You're not going to use all the sandpaper, and you're just going to waste, you know, abrasives, and you're going to be really frustrated. So the arbor nut for sanding discs is always going to be one of these sort of flat-surfaced nuts. So give it a few hand tightens, and you're in business. This is what we're looking for. We've got the sanding disc flush, almost flush with it's slightly below this shield or shroud, and it'll allow us to use as much of the surface area of the sanding disc as possible, so that if I was going to be grinding a piece of material, you can see that I can get really low without having an arbor nut or the shroud get in the way. And if I had some of this getting in the way, I'd be too high with my grinding angle, and you're just going to waste abrasives. If you find that you're only wearing like 1/4 of an inch or an 1/8 inch of this outer rim of the sanding disc, then your angle is too high, and you need to adjust that so you're much lower. If you're not quite fine-tuning it with whatever shims you have available in the tool crib, another perfectly acceptable way to shim up one of these sanding discs is to grab another sanding disc and back it up. And you can stack a few of them on there if you need to, and you can fine-tune that shimming operation. As long as the sanding discs that you're putting on below the one you're using are in good shape, they're complete, they don't have tears or chunks missing, this is a perfectly safe way to shim up the back of your sanding discs as well. And so you can see that made it even you know, more flush and tight. So we've got the shroud still protecting us from the material being ejected, and we still get that benefit of our low angle. So when you're using one of these angle grinders, make sure you're holding your material, your media correctly, and make sure 2 hands always. Always clamp down your work, and eye protection is an absolute must. I always prefer a face shield in addition to safety glasses when working with one of these.